The London morning air carried the familiar scent of rain and diesel fumes as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his worn leather jacket against the October chill. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he reached for the small blue inhaler in his breast pocket, a movement that had become as natural as breathing itself over the past 3 years. The asthma had started during his final tour in Afghanistan, a parting gift from the desert dust and chemical smoke that had filled his lungs during countless missions. At 62, Thomas carried himself with the practiced dignity of a man who had served his country for over 2 decades. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed, his posture straight despite the invisible weight he carried from memories that haunted his sleep. The medals tucked away in a drawer at home meant little now, but the discipline they represented still governed his daily routine. He walked slowly down the cobblestone path through Regent's Park, a route he had taken every morning for the past year, since moving to his small flat nearby. The pension wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him in a decent neighborhood where he could find some peace among the trees and open spaces that reminded him of better times. The park had become his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the cramped walls of his apartment and the memories that seemed to echo louder in enclosed spaces. Thomas paused by the ornamental lake, watching the ducks glide across the dark water. His breathing was labored this morning, more so than usual. The October air was thick with moisture, and he could feel his chest tightening with each inhale. He pulled out his inhaler again, checking to make sure it was there, a nervous habit he had developed since the attacks had become more frequent. The doctors had explained that stress could trigger his condition, and Thomas knew he had plenty of that. The transition from military life to civilian existence had been harder than any battlefield he had faced. In the army, he had purpose, structure, and brothers in arms who understood the language of duty and sacrifice. Now, he navigated a world that seemed to have forgotten about men like him, where his service was acknowledged with polite nods but little genuine understanding. His small pension barely covered his rent and medical expenses, forcing him to carefully budget every purchase. The inhalers were expensive, and without proper insurance coverage for veterans, each prescription was a financial burden. He had learned to ration his medication, using it only when absolutely necessary, a dangerous practice that his doctor had warned against repeatedly. As he continued his walk, Thomas noticed a group of young people gathered near the playground area. They appeared to be in their late teens or early 20s, their loud laughter and aggressive posturing immediately setting him on edge. He had encountered groups like this before in the neighborhood, kids who seemed to take pleasure in intimidating anyone they perceived as vulnerable. Their expensive sneakers and designer clothing suggested they weren't driven by desperation but by something darker, a need to assert dominance over those they saw as weak. Thomas tried to take a different path, but the group had already spotted him. Their conversation died down as they watched him approach, their eyes following his slow, deliberate movements with predatory interest. He kept his head down, focusing on his breathing and trying to project calm confidence despite the anxiety building in his chest. The leader of the group, a tall young man with bleached hair and multiple facial piercings, stepped directly into Thomas's path. His companions flanked him on either side, creating a human barrier that forced the veteran to stop. Thomas looked up, meeting the young man's cold stare with the steady gaze he had perfected during his military service. "Morning, Granddad," the leader said with mock politeness, his voice dripping with disdain. "Nice jacket. Bit old-fashioned, isn't it?" Thomas remained silent, calculating his options. The group numbered 5 in total, all young and fit, while he was outnumbered and struggling with his breathing. He had been in worse situations during his service, but those had been different. Then, he had been armed, trained, and surrounded by fellow soldiers. Now, he was alone and increasingly aware of his physical limitations. "Cat got your tongue?" Another member of the group taunted, stepping closer. This one was shorter but stockier, with amateur tattoos covering his forearms and the aggressive stance of someone looking for a fight. "Or maybe you're just scared?" Thomas's chest began to tighten more noticeably. The stress of the confrontation was triggering his asthma, and he could feel his airways beginning to constrict. He needed to get away from this situation quickly, but the group showed no signs of letting him pass. Instead, they seemed energized by his obvious distress, feeding off his vulnerability like wolves sensing wounded prey. "I don't want any trouble," Thomas said quietly, his voice steady despite the growing pressure in his chest. "I'm just trying to get home." The group erupted in laughter at his words, interpreting his attempt at de-escalation as weakness rather than wisdom. In their young minds, conditioned by years of online videos and social media bravado, backing down was equivalent to cowardice. They had no understanding of the restraint it took for a man with Thomas's training to choose peaceful resolution over violence. "Look at him," the leader mocked, mimicking Thomas's careful posture. "All polite and proper. What are you, some kind of teacher or something? Maybe a librarian?" Thomas felt his breathing becoming more labored. The familiar tightness in his chest was spreading, and he knew he needed his inhaler soon. He tried to step around the group, but they moved to block him again, their circle tightening like a noose. The situation was escalating beyond his control, and his military training told him to prepare for the worst-case scenario. "Please," he said, reaching slowly toward his jacket pocket. "I just need to take my medication." The movement was misinterpreted by the group as potentially threatening. The leader grabbed Thomas's wrist with surprising force, preventing him from accessing his inhaler. The veteran's eyes widened as he realized the gravity of his situation. Without his medication, this confrontation could become life-threatening. "What kind of medication?" the stocky one demanded, leaning in close enough that Thomas could smell the alcohol on his breath despite the early hour. "Something to make you brave? Maybe something illegal?" Thomas's breathing was becoming shallow and rapid. The combination of physical exertion, stress, and the inability to access his inhaler was creating a perfect storm for a severe asthma attack. He could feel his airways continuing to constrict, and panic began to set in as his body's natural response to the lack of oxygen. "It's just an inhaler," he gasped, his voice becoming weaker. "For my asthma. Please, I need it." The admission of vulnerability seemed to excite the group rather than generate sympathy. In their twisted worldview, they had found someone even more powerless than they had hoped. The leader's grip on Thomas's wrist tightened, while the others closed ranks around them, creating a wall that blocked the view of any potential witnesses. "An inhaler?" the leader repeated with exaggerated surprise. "Poor old man can't even breathe properly. What's it worth to you? Maybe we can work out some kind of deal." Thomas's vision was beginning to blur around the edges as his oxygen levels dropped. He had experienced attacks before, but this one was progressing faster than usual, amplified by the stress and physical confrontation. His free hand clutched at his throat instinctively, a gesture that made his distress obvious to anyone watching. But the group wasn't interested in helping. Instead, they seemed fascinated by his struggle, watching with the morbid curiosity of children torturing an animal. They had no understanding of the medical emergency unfolding before them, seeing only an opportunity to exercise power over someone they perceived as beneath them. "Please," Thomas wheezed, his voice barely audible now. "I can't breathe." The leader finally released his wrist, but instead of allowing Thomas to retrieve his inhaler, he shoved the veteran backward. Thomas stumbled, his coordination compromised by the lack of oxygen, and fell heavily to the ground. The impact jarred his already struggling respiratory system, making each breath a monumental effort. As he lay on the cold ground, Thomas reached desperately for his jacket pocket, his fingers fumbling with the zipper as his motor control deteriorated. The inhaler was there, just inches away, but his hands were shaking too badly to grasp it properly. The group stood over him, their laughter mixing with the sound of his labored breathing in a nightmarish symphony. From his position on the ground, Thomas could see other people in the park going about their morning routines, oblivious to his plight. A woman jogged past in the distance, earphones blocking out the world around her. An elderly man fed birds near the lake, focused entirely on his feathered companions. The isolation was complete, despite being surrounded by potential help. The leader of the group knelt down next to Thomas, his face close enough that the veteran could see the cold amusement in his eyes. There was no empathy there, no recognition of the humanity of the man struggling beneath him. To these young people, Thomas was nothing more than entertainment, a diversion from their boredom. "What's that in your pocket?" the leader asked with mock concern. "Looks like something important. Maybe we should take a look." With swift, practiced movements, he reached into Thomas's jacket and pulled out the blue inhaler. The veteran's eyes fixed on the small device that represented his lifeline, watching helplessly as it was held just out of reach. His gasps became more desperate, each breath a struggle against airways that were closing with each passing second. The inhaler was passed around the group like a trophy, each member examining it with curiosity and cruel amusement. They shook it, pretended to use it themselves, and made jokes about its purpose while Thomas lay below them, fighting for his life. The medication that could save him was being treated as a toy by people who had no concept of its importance. Thomas tried to speak, to plead for its return, but his voice had been reduced to barely audible whispers. His chest rose and fell rapidly as his body fought for oxygen, and his skin was beginning to take on a bluish tinge around his lips and fingernails. The medical emergency was progressing beyond the point where intervention might be effective, but the group remained oblivious to the severity of the situation. In his fading consciousness, Thomas's mind wandered to his days in service, when he had been strong and capable, surrounded by men and women who would have died to protect him as he would have for them. The contrast with his current helplessness was devastating, not just physically but emotionally. This wasn't how a soldier's story was supposed to end, gasping for air while strangers mocked his suffering. The park around them continued its normal rhythm, birds singing in the trees and leaves rustling in the autumn breeze. The beauty of the morning stood in stark contrast to the ugliness of human cruelty playing out on the path. Somewhere in the distance, Thomas could hear the measured footsteps of someone approaching, but his vision was too blurred to make out any details. As consciousness began to slip away from him, he wondered if this was how his story would end, not on a battlefield serving his country, but on a park path, the victim of senseless brutality by his own countrymen. The measured footsteps Thomas had heard belonged to Guardsman James Wellington of Her Majesty's Royal Guard, though he wasn't dressed in his ceremonial uniform this morning. Instead, he wore civilian clothes, dark jeans, a navy wool coat, and polished black boots that betrayed his military bearing even in casual dress. At 28, James carried himself with the precise posture and alert awareness that marked him as a professional soldier, traits that had been ingrained through years of service protecting the crown. James had been taking his regular morning run through Regent's Park, a routine he maintained even on his days off. Physical fitness was not just a requirement of his position but a personal discipline that helped him process the stresses of his demanding role. As a member of the Royal Guard, he was entrusted with protecting some of the most important figures in the realm, a responsibility that required constant vigilance and peak physical condition. The route through the park was one he knew well, having run it hundreds of times over the past 3 years since being stationed in London. He preferred the early morning hours when the paths were less crowded and the air was crisp and clean. The rhythm of his footsteps on the various surfaces, asphalt, gravel, and cobblestone, provided a meditative quality that helped clear his mind before returning to his duties. As he rounded the curve near the ornamental lake, James noticed a disturbance ahead that immediately triggered his professional instincts. His training had taught him to scan constantly for potential threats or situations requiring intervention, and what he saw made him slow his pace to better assess the scene. A group of young people were clustered together in what appeared to be a confrontational formation, their body language aggressive and predatory. James's enhanced hearing, honed by years of standing guard in various environments, picked up fragments of conversation that confirmed his suspicions. The tone was mocking and cruel, and he could hear labored breathing that suggested someone was in distress. His military experience had taught him to recognize the signs of a developing crisis, and every instinct told him that intervention would be necessary. Moving closer while maintaining a casual appearance, James was able to see the full scope of the situation. An older man lay on the ground, clearly struggling to breathe, while 5 young people stood around him in a loose circle. The victim's distress was obvious even from a distance. His rapid, shallow breathing and the way he clutched at his chest indicated a medical emergency in progress. James's training kicked in automatically. Years of emergency response drills and real-world situations had prepared him for exactly this type of scenario. He quickly assessed the tactical situation. 5 potential hostiles, 1 victim in medical distress, multiple potential exit routes, and his own capabilities and limitations as a single responder without backup or equipment. The group was so focused on their victim that they hadn't noticed James's approach. This gave him a significant tactical advantage, allowing him to observe their behavior and plan his intervention strategy. He could see that one of them was holding what appeared to be a small medical device, likely the inhaler the older man desperately needed. James recognized the symptoms of a severe asthma attack from his first aid training, knowledge that was regularly updated as part of his military service. The victim's bluish skin tone and increasingly desperate breathing indicated that this was rapidly becoming a life-threatening emergency. Every second of delay could mean the difference between a successful rescue and a tragic outcome. Drawing on his experience in crowd control and de-escalation, James formulated his approach. Direct confrontation might provoke the group to violence or cause them to scatter, potentially taking the inhaler with them. Instead, he would need to project authority while giving them an opportunity to save face and withdraw voluntarily. As he drew closer, James could hear more of the group's conversation. Their complete lack of awareness regarding the severity of the situation was shocking. They seemed to view the man's medical emergency as entertainment, passing around his inhaler like a trophy while making crude jokes about his condition. The casual cruelty was something James had encountered in various forms during his military service, but it never failed to disgust him. The leader of the group was a young man who carried himself with the artificial confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. His expensive clothing and groomed appearance suggested privilege rather than desperation, making his behavior even more reprehensible. This wasn't survival or even rational criminal activity. It was pure malice directed at someone vulnerable. James approached with measured steps, his military bearing becoming more pronounced as he entered what he mentally classified as a combat zone. Despite his civilian clothes, there was no mistaking him for an ordinary bystander. His posture, his purposeful movement, and the cold focus in his eyes marked him as someone accustomed to violence and unafraid to employ it when necessary. "Excuse me," James said in a voice that carried the unmistakable authority of command, despite its conversational volume. "I think you gentlemen need to move along." The group turned toward him with varying degrees of surprise and irritation. They had been so engrossed in their victims' suffering that James's approach had caught them completely off guard. The leader's face showed immediate calculation as he tried to assess this new threat while maintaining his dominant position over the situation. "This isn't your business, mate," the leader replied with false bravado, though James could see the uncertainty in his eyes. The young man was clearly trying to determine whether James represented a genuine threat or could be intimidated like their current victim. James's response was to step closer, closing the distance between them while keeping his hands relaxed at his sides. His movement was fluid and controlled, the product of countless hours of training in various combat disciplines. To a trained observer, every aspect of his positioning and posture screamed danger, but the young bullies lacked the experience to read these signs. "I'm making it my business," James said calmly, his gaze shifting briefly to the man struggling on the ground before returning to fix the leader with a stare that had been perfected standing guard over royalty. "That man needs medical attention, and you're preventing him from receiving it." The stocky member of the group stepped forward aggressively, interpreting James's calm demeanor as weakness rather than control. This was a common mistake made by people unfamiliar with military training, the assumption that restraint indicated inability rather than discipline. "There's 5 of us and 1 of you," the stocky youth said with sneering confidence. "Maybe you should mind your own business and keep walking." James smiled slightly, an expression that held no warmth and conveyed more menace than any threat could have. He had faced armed insurgents, dealt with international terrorists, and stood watch against threats that these youths couldn't begin to imagine. The idea that he might be intimidated by local bullies was almost amusing. "5 of you," James agreed conversationally. "That seems about right for a fair fight." The comment was delivered with such casual confidence that it momentarily stunned the group. They were accustomed to people backing down when faced with their numbers, not making jokes about the odds. The leader's face flushed with anger as he realized he was being mocked. But there was something about James's demeanor that prevented him from immediately escalating to violence. Behind them, Thomas's condition was deteriorating rapidly. His breathing had become even more labored, and his attempts to speak had been reduced to barely audible gasps. The medical emergency was progressing beyond the point where even immediate intervention might be effective, and James knew that time was running out. "Give me the inhaler," James said, his voice remaining calm but taking on a tone of absolute command. It was the same voice he used when giving orders to subordinates, carrying with it the expectation of immediate and unquestioning compliance. The leader still held the device, turning it over in his hands while trying to maintain his grip on a situation that was rapidly slipping from his control. He could sense that this newcomer represented a different level of threat than their usual victims, but his pride and the presence of his followers prevented him from backing down easily. "I don't think so," the leader said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had held earlier. "Maybe you should explain why we should listen to you." James's response was swift and decisive. Moving with the fluid precision of his training, he stepped forward and grasped the leader's wrist in a joint lock that caused immediate and excruciating pain. The technique was designed to gain compliance without causing permanent damage, a skill taught to all members of the Royal Guard for crowd control situations. The inhaler dropped from the leader's suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering onto the path near Thomas's prone form. James maintained the joint lock just long enough to ensure the young man understood the futility of resistance, then released him with a slight push that sent him staggering backward. "Because I asked nicely," James said, his tone remaining conversational despite the violence he had just demonstrated. He knelt down beside Thomas, quickly retrieving the inhaler while keeping one eye on the group of bullies. The older man's condition was critical. His lips had taken on a distinctly blue tinge, and his breathing was so labored that James could hear the wheeze from several feet away. Years of first aid training took over as the guardsmen assessed the situation and began providing assistance. "Sir, can you hear me?" James asked, his voice taking on the calm, reassuring tone used when dealing with medical emergencies. "I'm going to help you with your medication." Thomas's eyes focused on James with desperate gratitude. He was beyond the ability to speak, but his expression conveyed everything that needed to be said. The guardsman quickly examined the inhaler to familiarize himself with its operation, then positioned it correctly in Thomas's mouth. "When I tell you, try to take as deep a breath as you can," James instructed, his training in emergency medical procedures guiding his actions. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. He triggered the inhaler as Thomas attempted to inhale, delivering the life-saving medication directly to his constricted airways. The effect wasn't immediate, but James knew that patience was required for the medication to take effect and begin opening the breathing passages. The group of bullies stood frozen, unsure how to respond to this dramatic change in the situation. Their victim had been transformed from helpless prey into someone under the protection of a clearly dangerous individual. The leader was still nursing his wrist, the pain serving as a stark reminder of how quickly the tables had turned. "You lot need to leave," James said without looking up from his patient. "Now." The authority in his voice was absolute, carrying with it the implicit threat of consequences for noncompliance. The bullies exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier confidence completely evaporated. They were dealing with someone who operated by different rules than they were accustomed to, someone for whom violence was a tool rather than a game. The stocky youth who had been most aggressive earlier stepped forward again, but his movements were hesitant. "You can't just tell us what to do," he said, though his protest lacked conviction. James looked up from Thomas, and The expression on his face caused the young man to take an involuntary step backward. There was no anger there, no emotion at all, just the cold calculation of someone evaluating a potential threat and determining the most efficient way to neutralize it. "Walk away," James said simply, "while you still can." The quiet menace in his voice was more effective than any shouting or threats could have been. The bullies found themselves backing away almost involuntarily, their survival instincts finally overriding their adolescent bravado. They had encountered something beyond their understanding or ability to handle. Thomas's breathing was beginning to improve slightly as the medication took effect. The immediate crisis was passing, but James knew that the veteran needed proper medical attention to ensure his full recovery. He pulled out his mobile phone, preparing to call for an ambulance while keeping watch on both his patient and the retreating bullies. "Sir, help is coming," he assured Thomas, whose eyes were now focused and alert despite his continued breathing difficulties. "Just try to stay calm and let the medication work." The group of bullies had retreated to a safe distance but hadn't left entirely. They clustered together, arguing in hushed tones about what to do next. The leader was clearly furious at being humiliated, but also aware that any further confrontation would likely end badly for them. The others seemed ready to abandon the situation entirely, their appetite for violence significantly diminished by the encounter with James. As James dialed emergency services, he reflected on the chain of events that had led to this moment. His morning run had been transformed from routine exercise into a life-or-death rescue operation, but that was simply the reality of being a guardian. Whether protecting royalty or helping a stranger in need, the principles remained the same: strength in service of those who couldn't protect themselves. The phone call was brief and professional, providing the dispatcher with precise location information and a clear description of the medical emergency. James's military training had taught him the importance of accurate communication during crisis situations, and he made sure the responding medical team would have all the information they needed. Thomas was slowly regaining the ability to speak, though his voice remained weak and raspy. "Thank you," he managed to whisper, his eyes conveying a depth of gratitude that words couldn't fully express. "Don't try to talk yet," James advised. "Save your energy for breathing. The paramedics will be here soon." But even as he spoke those reassuring words, James could see that the group of bullies was regrouping. Their initial shock was wearing off, and he could see the leader whispering urgently to his followers. The situation was far from over, and James knew he would need to remain vigilant to ensure Thomas's safety until professional help arrived. The group of bullies had retreated approximately 20 meters down the path, far enough to feel safe from immediate retaliation but close enough to monitor the situation. Their heated discussion was becoming more animated, with several members gesturing angrily toward James and Thomas. The leader's humiliation was clearly eating at him, and his followers were growing restless as they waited for direction. James maintained his position beside Thomas, one hand resting protectively on the veteran's shoulder while his eyes tracked the movements of the potential threats. His military training had taught him never to trust that a dangerous situation was truly resolved until all hostile elements had been completely neutralized or removed from the area. The bullies' continued presence indicated that the confrontation might not be over. Thomas's breathing was slowly improving as the medication worked its way through his system. The desperate wheezing had subsided to labored but more regular respirations, and some color was returning to his lips. However, James knew from his first aid training that asthma attacks could be unpredictable, and that stress or exertion could trigger another episode at any time. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" James asked, his voice gentle but purposeful. He needed to assess Thomas's mental state and gather information that might be useful for the arriving medical personnel. "Thomas," the veteran whispered, his voice still weak but audible. "Thomas Mitchell." "I'm James," the guardsman replied. "You're going to be fine, Thomas. The ambulance should be here within minutes. And your breathing is already getting better." As if summoned by his words, the distant sound of sirens could be heard approaching through the London traffic. The emergency services were responding quickly, which would provide additional security as well as medical care. James knew that the presence of paramedics and potentially police would likely cause the bullies to disperse completely. However, the leader of the group seemed to have reached a different conclusion. Instead of retreating further, he was leading his followers back toward James and Thomas, his face set in an expression of determined malice. The young man's pride had been wounded, and he appeared willing to escalate the situation rather than accept defeat. "This isn't over," the leader called out as they approached, his voice carrying across the morning air. "You can't be everywhere, and we know this neighborhood." James stood slowly, positioning himself between the approaching group and the still vulnerable Thomas. His movement was deliberate and controlled, but there was something in his posture that made it clear he was prepared for whatever might come next. The casual facade was gone, replaced by the focused readiness of a professional warrior. "You're making a mistake," James said calmly, his voice carrying enough to reach the approaching group but not loud enough to seem aggressive or confrontational. "Walk away now and this ends here." The stocky member of the group, emboldened by their numbers and his leader's determination, stepped ahead of the others. His fists were clenched, and his body language screamed aggression. "You got lucky once," he snarled. "Let's see how tough you are when we're ready for you." James's response was a slight smile that never reached his eyes. He had faced down armed insurgents in hostile territory, dealt with international terrorists who would kill without hesitation, and stood guard against threats that these local thugs couldn't comprehend. The idea that he might be intimidated by street bullies was genuinely amusing. "Ready for me?" James repeated, his tone conversational. "I don't think you understand what that means." The leader had apparently decided that retreat was no longer an option. His reputation among his followers and in the neighborhood depended on maintaining his dominance, and being humiliated by a single man was unacceptable. The rational part of his mind might have recognized the danger, but pride and peer pressure had overwhelmed common sense. "5-on-1, the leader said, trying to project confidence he clearly didn't feel. "We'll see how tough you are." Behind James, Thomas was struggling to sit up, his breathing still labored but his awareness returning. The veteran could sense the escalating tension and recognized the tactical situation developing around him. Despite his weakened condition, his military instincts were asserting themselves. "Don't," Thomas wheezed, trying to warn James. "Just let them go." James glanced back briefly, his expression softening for a moment as he looked at the older soldier. There was something in Thomas's eyes that spoke of shared understanding, the recognition of one warrior by another. But James also saw the determination there, the refusal to be the cause of further violence even if it meant accepting his own humiliation. "It's not about letting them go," James replied quietly. "It's about making sure they understand that what they did here was wrong." The approaching bullies had spread out into a loose semicircle, a tactic they had probably seen in movies but executed with amateur clumsiness. Their positioning actually made them more vulnerable rather than more dangerous, creating angles that would allow James to deal with them individually rather than being overwhelmed by coordinated attack. The sirens were growing louder, indicating that help was only minutes away. Under normal circumstances, James might have been content to wait for backup, but the aggressive posturing of the group suggested they might attempt to finish what they had started before the authorities arrived. The veteran was still vulnerable, and the bullies had already demonstrated their willingness to harm someone in medical distress. "Last chance," James said, his voice taking on the tone of absolute finality that he used when delivering ultimatums. "Leave now or face the consequences." The stocky youth responded by charging forward with a wild swing that telegraphed his intentions from several feet away. James stepped aside easily, using the attacker's momentum against him with a hip throw that sent the young man tumbling onto the hard path. The technique was textbook perfect, requiring minimal force while maximizing the impact on the aggressor. The ease with which James had dealt with their most aggressive member caused the others to hesitate momentarily. They had expected a brawl, not the clinical efficiency of professional combat training. The leader's face flushed with anger and embarrassment as he realized that his grand gesture of defiance was rapidly becoming another humiliation. "Get him!" the leader shouted. abandoning any pretense of controlled aggression. The remaining 4 members of the group rushed forward simultaneously, their coordination poor but their intent unmistakable. James's training took over completely as he shifted into combat mode, his civilian persona dropping away to reveal the elite soldier beneath. The first attacker reached him slightly ahead of the others, throwing a haymaker punch that James deflected with his forearm while delivering a sharp elbow strike to the solar plexus. The young man doubled over gasping, effectively removed from the fight without sustaining serious injury. James's training emphasized controlled force, enough to neutralize threats without causing permanent damage. The second attacker tried to grab James from behind, a mistake that cost him dearly. The guardsman ducked under the grasping arms, spun around the attacker's body, and applied a rear-naked choke that cut off blood flow to the brain. Within seconds, the young man was unconscious and dropping harmlessly to the ground. The leader and 1 remaining follower stopped their advance, suddenly confronted with the reality that 3 of their number had been neutralized in less than 30 seconds. The clinical efficiency with which James had dismantled their attack was terrifying to observe, making it clear that they were dealing with someone whose skills far exceeded their own. "This is what training looks like," James said calmly, not even breathing hard despite the brief but intense physical confrontation. "This is what happens when you pick the wrong target." Thomas watched from his position on the ground, his veteran's eye recognizing the professional competence on display. Despite his weakened condition, he felt a surge of pride seeing a younger soldier upholding the values of service and protection. The contrast between James's disciplined response and the chaotic aggression of the bullies was striking. The sound of sirens was now very close, indicating that emergency services would arrive within moments. The leader of the bullies cast desperate glances between James and the approaching help, calculating whether he had time for one final attempt at salvaging his reputation or whether discretion had finally become the better part of valor. "This isn't over," he said again. But his voice lacked conviction. The threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Yes, it is," James replied with absolute certainty. "You've already lost. The only question now is whether you're smart enough to accept it." The unconscious member of the group was beginning to stir, while the one who had been hit in the solar plexus was still struggling to catch his breath. The stocky youth who had initiated the physical confrontation was sitting on the path, holding his bruised ribs and looking dazed. The overwhelming superiority of James's combat skills had been demonstrated beyond any doubt. An ambulance rounded the corner into view, its blue lights flashing and siren wailing. Behind it, James could see a police car following, responding to what had likely been reported as both a medical emergency and a public disturbance. The arrival of official help would change the dynamic of the situation dramatically. The leader made his decision, gesturing frantically for his followers to retreat. They gathered up their wounded and began moving away from the scene, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. The reality of facing potential arrest charges in addition to their physical defeat had finally penetrated their juvenile sense of invincibility. James remained in position between the retreating bullies and Thomas until they were completely out of sight. Only then did he relax slightly, though his military training kept him alert for any signs of renewed threat. The veteran's breathing had continued to improve throughout the confrontation,